Pista di bonus. The Mourning. Trish offers flowers. There are many here among us who feel that life is but a joke, but you and I, we've been through that. And this is not our fate, so let us not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late. Bob Dylan, All Along the Watchtower. Trish Una had a full view of the town and sea from the small hill she was standing on. A refreshing breeze was blowing. She was standing in front of a grave. The headstone was fairly small and included a respectable amount of humble decorations. There was another grave next to it, but it looked relatively simple and plain. The two neighboring tombstones were each engraved with the name of the deceased. One was Bruno Bucciarati, the other one held his father's name. The father's headstone was simple, as his son didn't have much money when it was built. There had been talk about his son giving him a more worthy grave someday, but he had died himself before he was able to. When he was buried, people brought up rebuilding his father's gravestone as well, but a friend of his father's fishing buddies asserted, nah, he definitely wouldn't want that. He'd want to sleep peacefully, in the grave as it was, built by his son. So it was left alone. The calm atmosphere atop that hill ought to have made visitors feel at peace, but they couldn't even imagine such. The person resting here, Bruno Bucciarati, was the former leader of the secret society known as Passione, and had been a key person in the dark network that laid the foundation for the organization that was now growing at a rapid pace, a very important person and such. Contrary to the bloodiness of his life, where many people had come close to killing him, one indeed had succeeded, and where he had sometimes killed as well, his grave was simple, with no traces of pointless gaudiness or twisted vanity. It was Trish's first time coming to this grave. She hadn't attended the burial. The boy with the curly blonde hair had prevented her from doing so, saying it was better if she didn't go. Nevertheless, she had finally ended up coming today. She had brought a single white flower, which she placed in front of the headstone. She had struggled with what to bring, and ultimately went with a tulip. I thought about what I should do, and hey, your hairstyle resembled a tulip, so it's a lame joke, but I just felt like it. Yeah. She gave a small giggle. She had come here today by chance, as there were things she had stopped in town to do. She was taking a shot at restarting her singing career after it had been interrupted by her mother's death, and was on her way home from one of her jobs appearing on the town's radio station. She was supposed to return to the company immediately, but had told her manager that she couldn't, and so made time to visit the grave. It's harder than I expected, Bucciarati. I'm busy with a lot of things now. It's different from when I was being chauffeured around by you guys, doing as I was told. She gave a sigh. The days that had felt like a storm of restlessness, fear, and courage had long since passed. Nowadays, she felt like it had all been some sort of dream. But it wasn't a dream, and Bucciarati was really resting underneath a gravestone. That's right. You're really... Closing her eyes and looking upward, she stood still in the silence, until a timid voice sounded from behind her. I'm just wondering, did you, by any chance, know Bruno? When she turned toward the voice, Trish saw a well-dressed woman standing there alone. Her face was pretty and practically void of wrinkles. She looked like she could still be considered a young lady, but her expression was somewhat somber. Trish gave a soft gasp, understanding as soon as she saw her. The resemblance was uncanny. There was no doubt that they were related. Are you Bucciarati's mother? The woman nodded in response as she bowed. Yes, I am, but I hardly had a chance to see him recently. When I got the news, it was already time for the funeral. Did you also attend? Trish shook her head. She didn't care if she was accused of being heartless, but his mother was looking at her. By any chance, she said, do you know how he died? You were there back then, weren't you? Her assumption was right on the mark. At a loss for words, Trish went silent. She could still recall, like yesterday, the scene from back then. Hey, Bucciarati. Mista addressed him in a shaky voice, but the man lying on the pavement gave no response. Though his eyelids were open, his eyes no longer saw anything. Bucciarati was clearly dead. They were at the Roman Colosseum. It was where their last battle had taken place, where they had finally managed to defeat the enemy, Diavolo, after a vicious fight. They could still hear some commotion nearby, the chaos that the battle had caused throughout the whole city still in the process of settling. Only this area seemed to be cut off from the confusion, a strange silence falling. What the hell, Bucciarati? Are you messing around? Come on, that's enough. Mista shook his body, but there was no response. Trish was stunned, seeing him in that state. She couldn't believe it either. Bucciarati was supposed to still be safe, so why was he apparently dead here? And what else did the stiff joints and the pale skin say besides confirming his death? Just as she had that thought, an awful cracking sound echoed in the vicinity. It was the sound of bones crumbling in the body that Mista was shaking. He instinctively pulled back with a start, but even if the bones were broken, the body couldn't have said anything about it. Finally, the third person among them, the boy holding the turtle to his chest, opened his mouth. That's enough, Mista. He's been dead for a long time. He isn't coming back. The quiet voice resonated heavily around them. He's not. Mista turned toward the boy, who nodded. You must have realized it too. Bucciarati originally died back when we first ran into Diavolo. He had been working with a dead body up until now. Maybe it was because of this power. Maybe his determination caused a miracle. I can't say for certain, but Bucciarati fought while knowing he couldn't save himself, that it was too late. He can't come back. Matter of fact, logical, these were words that left no room for any doubt, but Mista was not looking for logic. He moved in a flash. Kicking the ground, he put distance between them, jumped into an opportune position, and held up his gun, aiming at his target, right in the middle of the boy's forehead. Even with the barrel of the gun directed at him, the boy appeared completely calm. He just stood there, without even letting go of the turtle he was holding in his hand. What the hell is this? Mista asked the boy in a shaking voice. Again, the boy said quietly, You should realize it now, then. There's nothing to wonder about. Don't fuck with me, Mista yelled, scowling at him. Explain! Give me a damn good explanation! The boy didn't reply, however, simply staring back at Mista silently. An increasingly intense aura simmered between them. Trish hadn't moved during all the hostility. Somebody stop them, she thought, turning her gaze toward Bucciarati, but naturally he couldn't say anything anymore. What are you doing? She called out to him in her head. You're the one who brought us to this place. Why aren't you saying anything now that we're here? She wanted to scream, but his body stayed still. Mista continued pointing the barrel of his gun at the boy, ready to kill. You mean you knew everything this whole damn time? Encouraging Bucciarati, letting him betray the boss. The boy responded to Mista's trembling voice with a crystal clear declaration. That's right. The wrinkles in Mista's forehead were etched so deeply that they could have been carved. And you already know, I was the one leading, but this was what Bucciarati wanted and decided on his own. He hoped that someone would give him a push. I was only helping him. You know that Bucciarati wasn't the sort of man to let other people force him or to waver in his convictions. The boy didn't falter at all. Mista's entire body was shaking and trembling, but with a habit that was deeply instilled in him, his pistol didn't move an inch. No matter how shaken he was a formidable gunman who always kept his aim. You, who the fuck do you think you are? Mista shouted. Staring directly into his eyes, the boy said, I, Giorno Giovanna, have a dream. That was his catchphrase, words that Mista had heard often during the course of the violent adventure. Right now you have two paths, he said, as if admonishing him. Then suddenly he asked, Mista, you hate the number 4, right? Yeah, what about it? At Mista's befuddlement, the boy continued, "Right now, if you shoot me, I'll be the fourth one." The corner of Mista's mouth began to twitch. He understood what the boy was saying. Their teammates, the ones who had been sacrificed, Leone Abacchio, Narancia Girga, Bruno Bucciarati. 3 of them were already dead. If Giorno was killed here, then that would indeed be the 4th sacrifice. Mista broke out into a cold sweat, his back teeth beginning to chatter. That's just a stretch, really. The boy nodded. "You're absolutely right. But it's your obsession, Mista. It doesn't matter to me. You're the only one who will have a problem with it. It's up to you to decide." Mista listened, his whole body heaving with deep breaths. "Right now, you have 2 paths you can choose. One is to take down the despicable person standing before you, who caused your teammates' deaths, and settle everything so far. That in itself should be meaningful. But it does mean you must free yourself from this uneasy life where you've bound yourself to the curse of the number 4. The other path, the path where you keep living with this obsession. I know this obsession is important to you, but this way of thinking means that you won't pull the trigger at this very moment. It's a weakness of yours. And know this, if you choose the life where you continue to avoid any 4th option, even if you find it necessary to pick it, I won't hesitate to choose that 4th option instead of you. That's one of my responsibilities now." What? Mista's throat made a strange gulping noise. He swallowed. "What are you going to do now?" "Well, you already know that too." For a moment, Mista looked furious at the boy's words, holding his pistol at the ready again, and he pulled the trigger. Gunshots rang out. Trish instinctively closed her eyes and covered her ears, crouching in place. The echoes of the gunshots faded into the vast space of the Colosseum. Everything was dead silent. Trish nervously opened her eyes and saw Mista's figure. Smoke was rising from the barrel of his gun. Following the direction in which it was pointing, smoke could also be seen rising up from the point of impact. There were holes in the pavement. In front of this, the boy holding the turtle was still standing. 3 bullet holes. Upon confirming this, the boy gave a calm smile. "As I thought, you couldn't fire 4 shots, could you?" "Don't look down on me. My obsession is a universal truth, and there's not a single guy who can change that. So, if there's a time when you give up being a member of Team Bucciarati, if you ever renounce being that 4th option, then I'll be putting a bullet right in your brain. Got it?" Mista spun his pistol around in his hand and put it away. Carrying the turtle under his arm, the boy slowly walked over and knelt down beside Bucciarati's body. Reaching out a hand, he gently stroked the pale face and addressed the corpse in a sincere whisper. "Bucciarati, when we first met, and you licked my cheek, you saw through my lie. But there won't be any more lies, I swear on your soul." Mista was standing beside him right at that moment, in the middle of a troubled, dirty, crooked, and old world. There was a brand new glow. Passione was reborn. The boy lifted his head to look at Trish, who was vacantly watching the spectacle, and said, "This is as far as you go, Trish Una." It was a declaration. Even now, she remembered it clearly. It was engraved in her mind, the image of Bucciarati motionless on the pavement back then. But that wasn't exactly how he had died. They had just found out that he had already been dead for a long time. For her, Bucciarati was a lifesaver, representing the courage to forge one's destiny without hesitation, a light vigorously pursued in the darkness. But he was dead now. The road where she had relied on him had come to him for support and followed close behind him. The truth was that it had been over from the very beginning. While she was being saved, fate had already labeled him as one who had served his purpose and sent him to the afterlife. She wondered if she could explain that. She wondered how she would be able to express it, how to inform his mother of her son's fate. Trish was at a loss for words when Bucciarati's mother gave a sigh and said, "I wonder if he resented me." Although it seemed like a question, it had enough sorrow for a soliloquy.
When we got divorced, he chose to stay with his father and not me. Honestly, even now I'm a little bitter. I don't know why he always had to choose the hard way. Who's to blame? Was I that awful?
She hung her head, her shoulders shaking. Trish was nearly petrified of the painful feelings rising up from the bottom of her heart, but even so, she walked over to her and gently placed a hand on her back.
He didn't resent anyone. I'm sure of it, she said. But I had some serious problems with my real father, and he helped me. That's when he said it. I told him I was worried about whether or not I would be able to like my father. He immediately told me, with no hesitation, no parents and their child worry about such things. I'm sure that he didn't think badly of his parents at all.
Trish spoke in a steady tone that surprised even herself.
How can I say these things so arrogantly? I thought I was the kind of person that other people considered a spoiled and selfish daughter. Bujarati and the others, they're the ones who were strange for wanting to protect me. Maybe Fuga was right in abandoning me. After all, it was my fault that Abacchio and Narancia died. Even if Bruno was as noble as I say, how can I be the one to so self-assuredly say these things to a mother whose son has died?
Deep down, Trish was strangely conflicted. Bujarati's mother lifted her head and said with a bit of a curious expression,
"There's something familiar about you." Huh? When I told him that we were getting a divorce, his eyes, they looked like that back then. Why?
She asked. Trish naturally had no way of knowing what things were like back then, but she felt like she could picture young Bujarati in her mind. Trish softly shook her head and said,
I guess it's because I was acting like him. We're not the same, but I was thinking that I wanted to be like him. Do you think Bruno was happy?
When his mother asked this, thinking about her son, Trish didn't have to feel conflicted.
I'm sure that he had no regrets. I believe he died telling his friends his last wishes, but I unfortunately didn't get to be a part of that circle.
She gave a gloomy smile. That was right. Bujarati had no regrets. Mista and the golden-haired boy couldn't afford to look back, but only Trish's heart was left behind somewhere in that Colosseum, living suspended in the air. Bujarati's mother took a long look at Trish.
What did you think of Bruno?
She asked it bluntly, but Trish didn't hesitate.
He was an awful person, she answered immediately. Even though he rescued me from hopelessness and wanted me to keep my will to live, in the end I just got abandoned, she said with a wry smile.
His mother was silent for a moment, but then gave a similar smile.
Was he now? He was that kind of kid for me too. He was really smart, and he seemed like he could do anything. He even let me follow my dream, choosing his father and not his mother. He ended up throwing me away as well. An awful child. He really was, wasn't he?
The two of them smiled together, trembled just the same, and their eyes welled up with tears at the same moment.
Giorno, you may have a dream. You may take everything, even sadness, and make it powerful. But we can't live so frankly.
Trish looked up at the sky. The clouds passed overhead with considerable speed.
Well, that doesn't sound very good.
As Trish murmured this, a gust of wind blew the white tulip she had placed in front of the headstone, sending it landing onto the fresh grass. The Mourning closed. I know you'll probably scream and cry that your little world won't let you go, but who in your measly little world are you trying to prove that you're made out of gold and can't be sold? Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced? God damn, it has been a while since I've had to do Mista's voice, and I've completely forgotten how. I remember when I was doing the Purple Haze Feedback audiobook thinking, it's good that Mista and Giorno don't really have a scene together, so I can make their voices sound kind of similar and get away with it. Of course, that's come to bite me in the ass. But wow, what a crazy thing to go back to those characters' voices. I kind of understand what it must have felt like for, like when actors get offered roles that they did like 10, 20 years ago. Well, I was thinking about Mark Hamill specifically, having to come back to Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, and there's a lot of interviews of him going, that's not my Luke Skywalker, which was respectable because Last Jedi was an interesting movie. And the less said about that here, the better, I think, just for the sake of keeping to topic. This chapter was kind of a crazy thing to make. First of all, the one that's weighing the most on my mind right now is the music. Putting the background music on this is really challenging because I haven't had to work with music for a long time. In my audiobooks, I've strayed away from music, but all of Purple Haze feedback had music, and so I thought it was a good idea to try that format, and it's been really challenging both to find the right music pieces as well as to fit them under the voice so the voice isn't being drowned out or anything like that. So yeah, that's the thing that's really been taking a lot of my time right now and a lot of my mental energy. The recording itself took a long time as well, just because, first of all, I was scared to do Giorno and Mista and Trish especially. I remember thinking as well when I was doing Purple Haze feedback, it's a good thing Trish only has a couple of lines on the radio, because I don't know if I can do a female voice for this for like a whole chapter. And then now we have two female characters talking to each other. So that was really annoying, but yeah, I kind of got through it in the end. Since this chapter, way back in like 2018, 2019, when the chapter was first translated, I remember going, yeah, this will be a nice thing to sort of wrap up the Purple Haze feedback portion of my channel, so to speak, and put it all away in a nice container so that I don't have to look at it again. And then it took 3 years for me to actually dig into it. Now, let's talk about the chapter itself. I think this is it does for Trish what the rest of Purple Haze feedback does for Fugo. And it's interesting because unlike Fugo, Trish didn't really need it. Like her whole story arc had to do with escaping the fate that Diavolo had set for her, that of her death, obviously. But, the character who helped her escape from that was Bruno, right? Most significantly. Of course, there's that scene in the elevator, which gets referenced in this chapter. Like I said in other parts of my channel, other videos, probably my favorite scene from part 5, where they're sitting in the elevator and Bruno is trying to like comfort her, tell her that, like having to meet your father, it's not something you have to worry about because there's no parent or child should ever feel like the one does not love the other. Of course, he doesn't know he's dealing with psychotic, who really should have used a VPN, I suppose. He's trying to keep his anonymity as close to his chest as possible. Speaking of which, this episode is sponsored by NordVPN. No, it's not. I'm kidding. That moment when he turns around and he sees that all he has left, all he's holding onto is Trish's severed arm because Diavolo was so cruel to his own daughter that he actually cut off her hand just to... It's hard to put into words how sort of twisted that is, But that moment when we go into his flashback, and then it comes back out, and his face is contorted with rage, and he's going, you deceived my heart twice, and he goes after Diavolo seeking full revenge, completely disregarding whether he's gonna die or not. It's not even in his mind at the moment. All he wants is to secure Trish. It's such a powerful, emotional moment. And so to see that from Trish's perspective, or to see the consequences of that, the emotional consequences of that from Trish's perspective, how she comes to sort of idolize Bruno, and of course, the guilt she feels over his death, if not also Narancia and Abacchio's on top of that. It was really, really interesting to read. And so for those reasons, it's a really good wrap up to Trish's character in the way that Fugo had to deal with his guilt of leaving the gang when they sort of needed him most. The difference, I think, is the fact that Fugo got to meet Giorno at the end of it. And I think that's a really important distinction because it really cements in the author's mind, whose name I still do not remember, Kadano Kohei, that's his name, isn't it? Kadano Kohei, the author of Purple Haze feedback. He's got this very unique outlook on Giorno, and I remember talking about this multiple times when I was doing my Purple Haze feedback analyses, essentially saying, it's not really fair to Bruno that Giorno is the one claiming, that he was the leader behind all this. But we sort of see a bit more of that here, like we see Giorno himself defending Bruno and saying, look, Bruno wasn't the kind of person who you could tell what to do. You couldn't change his mind about certain things. Obviously, he'd already decided what to do with the boss. It's just, this was the moment that spurred him into action. I was the opportunity. I was the one who killed, the leaders above Bruno, and ultimately allowed for that progression that gave Bruno the space and the opportunity to confront someone who had betrayed him, if not once before, then certainly now in trying to kill Trish. We sort of see Kadenoko Hei's perspective on Giorno there as someone who provides opportunity to people. It's something like that. And Fugo, that's sort of the journey that that's the journey that Fugo gets when he gets reinducted into Passione. That's the story of Purple Haze Feedback. And right at the end, he meets Giorno and he sort of feels like he's being elevated spiritually. And the difference is that Trish doesn't get that. Trish only ever has Bruno to attach herself to. And in fact, she sort of resents Giorno at the very end of this chapter, where she goes, not all of us can live as proudly, as nobly as you do. And so that's a really sort of sad thing to realize, that Trish is always going to be stuck in the past a little bit because she never had this alleviating experience, this connection with Giorno the way the other characters did. Another really good representative of that is the fact that she lost her mother recently, and now she's speaking to Bruno's mother, and so they kind of have this dialogue where one is grieving, more or less, and trying to recover from the death of her mother and everything that entailed, i.e. the entirety of the entirety of part 5. And then we have Bruno's mother, who was abandoned by her son from, a long time ago, and then once again, without ever being able to truly reconnect with him, had to lose him a second time. So, there's that really nice connection there as well. And all around, like a really, I think, a well-constructed chapter that it's not like it ties up loose ends with Purple Haze Feedback, but like Purple Haze Feedback itself, it ties up loose ends with part 5. And so for that reason, I don't know, it reads kind of awkwardly as an epilogue to Purple Haze Feedback, but it reads really well if it was something that you read immediately after part 5, which strangely is almost exactly the same thing that I said for Purple Haze Feedback when I did the review of that book. Back in 2017, 2018. So it's, I guess, in a weird parallel, these two texts, written both by Kadenoko Hei, written with the same name, essentially. They're both Purple Haze Feedback, right? But they represent different things, but they share the same concept. I know I just said a lot of things that might have contradicted one another, but hopefully you see where I'm getting at. Overall, like an interesting read. My only regret with it, again, is the fact that I've sort of fallen out of practice with these voices, and some of them sounds a little bit wonky at times. Hopefully it wasn't too distracting, and hopefully the music wasn't too distracting either, because, I've completely lost practice with that aspect as well. It's good to put a wrap on Purple Haze Feedback, and I know a lot of people have been asking for a reading of this specific chapter and what I thought and all this stuff. So for those of you, if you're still around, hopefully you are, that's what I think, and I hope you enjoyed the reading. It was kind of a melancholy ending to part 5. I will say, the final, considering that this is the bonus chapter, right? It's meant to be the very final thing. Like, how can I say this? So Purple Haze Feedback was a postscript to part 5, so to speak, and then this is sort of the postscript to Purple Haze Feedback. So, and then the final sentence of this is Trish's flower getting blown off of Bruno's grave, as if to say, what we celebrate and what we remember about these people, it's temporal, and things can be unsettled through time, and why we celebrate these people, and even if it's worth celebrating these people, can be called into question. It's a very sort of melancholy ending, but in a way, part 5 never did have that perfect happy ending. Of course, Diavolo died. Diavolo didn't even die, did he? That's part of the melancholy ending. It's that Diavolo suffers for eternity. I was going to say Diavolo is defeated. But it comes at a great cost, these 3 sacrifices, as this chapter describes it. 3 sacrifices. And moreover, everyone is sort of confused and lost at the very end of part 5, as if to say, is this really how things ought to have been? Like, sure, Giorno is boss, but Polnareff's in a turtle. There's all this weird stuff happening, and you don't really know if this is the ending that ought to have been. And I really like that this chapter, even though it is a more satisfactory ending than just Mista, that shot of Mista and Trish running back to the Colosseum being like, hey, Bruno's probably waking up, which for what it's worth, I really did not like that ending when I first read part 5. I was like, come on, you gotta follow through on that. You gotta show us Mista reacting to Bruno's corpse. You gotta give us. So I did like that this chapter gave us that. And as much as it was satisfactory to read that interaction and to see it played out, and it did justice to the characters, I would say. So it didn't feel like out of place. It didn't feel like they were acting unnaturally. That was all very satisfactory, but it still did end on this melancholy note. And so that felt still very true to part 5. So overall, a really interesting ending to part 5 as a whole, saga at this point. But again, my old review still holds from Purple Haze feedback that it reads really well as an ending to part 5, but as a sort of independent chapter, it's not as convincing, let's say. Yeah, so you always have to keep in mind that this is a response to part 5 rather than like a side story with these characters, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's enough rambling, I think. I will say in the background is this wonderful organ cover of Ashes to Ashes by David Bowie. I'm sure you guys have been listening to that, and for some of you must have recognized it. And there's a link to that in the description if you guys were curious where to get that. So yeah, that's all for now. And so I'll see you guys for future videos. Of course, there will be future videos. This isn't just a one and done. It's not like, hey guys, this is the ending to Purple Haze feedback, and this is also the ending to my channel. No way, man. We've got Over Heaven to do. We've got George Joestar to do. We have Fourth Another Day, the book, to do as well. I hope you guys stick around for that. And it's all coming hard and fast. There will be a channel update coming very soon that I'm recording on Sunday. And yeah. It's a good time to be on the channel, and I hope you guys decide to stay. Take care, and goodbye.